everyone. I'm Ava. I'm from Carborough, North Carolina, and I'm a sophomore at UNC, majoring in Spanish and Global Studies. And I've been fortunate enough to travel to Spain, Cuba, and Costa Rica. And I did a language school in Costa Rica and did some volunteering in Cuba. And I speak both Spanish and English. And I was in a dual language program, so I learned Spanish starting in kindergarten all the way up through middle school. And I also enjoy playing beach volleyball.
It's like we're ready. So we're going to turn over to Ava, and she's going to talk a little bit about immigration, which maybe will make a little bit more sense after you've heard what Jake had to say about some of the history of Cuba.
So the first instance of Cubans in the U.S. was around 1565 when Spanish-Cuban soldiers moved their families from Cuba to St. Augustine, Florida. And then there is a larger immigration of Cubans from 1778 to 1802 into the U.S. territory under Spanish rule, which included Louisiana and Texas. And then eventually they started traveling to places like New York and settling in New Orleans and Key West. And this was in part because of deterioration of relations between Spain and Cuba during the time and uncertainty about Cuban independence. And then in 1869, there was a large immigration to Key West for direct access to the main market for the tobacco industry. So a lot of people involved with the tobacco industry in Cuba came and settled in Key West because the US was one of the main buyers of Cuban tobacco at the time.
So yeah, Cuban immigration has been going on for a long time, for 500 years to the United States. And then yeah, there's currently today a very large population in Florida of Cubans. And there's also a decent amount of Cubans in North Carolina. I know in Raleigh there's I think that's where the most Cubans live in the state of North Carolina. I'd have to double check that to be sure.
So then in 1885, there was the majority of the Cubans who settled in Key West moved to Tampa because cigar manufacturers
the screen. I'll bring it back 1 second. I've got a lot of things. Sorry, Ava and everyone. Just give me 1 second. We'll bring it
You're
back.
good.
I don't know why it went away. All right. Now it's going to take a minute to load.
We were on slide 26, Liz.
Thank you, Jake. Okay. All right, we're back.
So in 1885, there was beginning talk of the Cuban independence. And so when cigar manufacturers who had established themselves in Key West decided to move to Tampa because they were worried about the disruptions occurring in Cuba and that interfering with their business. And then we see another large migration of Cubans to the US from 1900 to 1950, the majority of them settling in the Northeast US. And that was during the Great Depression. And so trying to seek for economic reasons coming to the US. And also because there was a military dictatorship of Batista during that time period, and a lot of people were not happy with the way he was ruling. And then from 1959 to 1980s, There's a lot of upper class landowning Cubans that fled to the US during or after the revolution, and settled primarily in Miami. And then afterward, we see an immigration of middle and lower class Cubans as well coming to Miami and other parts of the US. And then in 1980, there was another large migration because there was a sharp decline in the Cuban economy. And that was called the Mariel boat lift, because Cubans traveled from the Mariel Harbor in Cuba to the US. So since the late 1980s, many Cuban immigrants also traveled, arrived in Mexico and then traveled across the Texas-Mexico border. So as you can see on the map, Cuba and Mexico are pretty close. So people would travel from Cuba to Isla Mujeres, which is on the Yucatan Peninsula, and then from there go up to Texas and cross the border. And those without family in Miami would settle in Houston. And the name for that was, those immigrants were referred to as Dusty Foot. So there is a policy that has been in place since the 1960s called it's nicknamed Wet Foot, Dry Foot, that anyone who emigrated from Cuba to the US would be able to legally remain here and obtain formal residency after 1 year. And that was revised in 1965, that if you were a Cuban caught in the water between Cuba and the US, then you would have to go back to Cuba. But if you had landed and put your feet on US, hence the name Dry Foot, then you could stay and become a legal resident. So this policy was ended after the Cuban thaw, which Jake referred to, when there was like a warming of relations between US and Cuba in 2014. So that's a picture of Obama with Raul Castro. And Obama ended the wet foot, dry foot policy because the Cuban government agreed. For a long time, Cuban government did not accept returning Cubans. And so they agreed to start accepting Cuban nationals. And so they ended that policy to kind of encourage Cubans to go emigrate back to Cuba. But because of the ending of that policy, a lot of people who were in Cuba don't have citizenship because they were legal permanent residents, but didn't get actual citizenship. So that has caused a panic among some people here. So a huge part of the Cuban economy are remittances, which is money sent from relatives living outside of Cuba back to family members that they have that are still living in Cuba. And so in 2016, there was around $3,000 million in remittances sent back to Cuba, and it's a huge source of income for Cubans. So these are the different elements of the Cuban economy. So there's tobacco, sugar, nickel, different agricultural products, tourism, and then exporting medicine and seafood. But like I said, that because of the embargo, Cuban economy has been suffering for a while. And so they rely really heavily on money sent in from people living outside of Cuba.